Rose DeJarnette is the Assistant Department Chair of General Education and Distance Learning and Professor of Reading and Literacy at Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida. She created the Torch Lab curriculum that helps Beacon students continue working on literacy through their general education coursework. Dr. Benjamin Powers is the Executive Director of the Southport School, an independent day school for neurodiverse children in grades 2 through 8 who have language-based learning differences and/or ADHD. He is also the founder and Executive Director of the Southport CoLab, Director of the Global Literacy Hub at the Yale Child Studies Center, a senior scientist with Haskin Laboratories, and the President of the Dyslexia Foundation. Allison Young is a former teacher and reading specialist for Broward County Public Schools and stayed for 10 years and is now the owner of the Learning Lab, a Florida-based program that provides a tailored learning environment to help dyslexic readers and ADHD students close their learning gaps to help catapult them to success and confidence in educational settings and in life. And we're going to start our conversation with Rose. Rose, can you tell us what are some of the essential components of reading instruction and how they are supported by the science of reading?
Well, we think of reading and the science of reading as components, but I like to call them pillars and think of them as almost like building a house. So with these 5 pillars and with building in reading, we think of phonemic awareness and phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. With phonemic awareness, we think of kind of those words that and those pieces that separate sounds and being able to hear, blend, segment, and manipulate those sounds. With phonics, it's really about that relationship between letters and sounds. Our vocabulary are the words that we are able to communicate effectively with. Fluency is being able to read accurately and quickly with expression. And comprehension is the whole purpose of our reading. So being able to understand and make meaning when we read. And so those 5 pillars are really those building blocks of our reading.
All right, well, thank you. So Dr. Powers, can you tell us how, in a Reader's Digest condensed version, how our brain processes language?
Sure. So as Rose just highlighted, there are a lot of different elements to the reading process. And so when we think about reading, sometimes we think about decoding and being able to sound out the individual words on a page. And then all the way, actually, what reading is supposed to be, the outcome is comprehension. And so because of that, there are a number of areas of our brain that are associated with the reading process. And so really one of the big challenges in our brain as we're developing our reading skill is that reading is not an innate process for us. Something like speech, we are born with an innate, for most people, an innate ability around speech, whereas reading is something we have to develop within the brain. And so there are certain parts of our brain that are associated with aspects of lifting the letters off the page and decoding them and then linking them with sounds. And then there are other parts of our brain that then take those sounds that are turned into words and connect them to meaning. And so there are parts of the brain that really map out very different aspects of the reading process. And what's important is that these different parts of the brain are connected, and there are these connections that are developed as we become proficient readers, these white matter pathways. And the white matter pathways, they're white because of this stuff called myelin that surrounds these nerve fibers. And that myelin is like insulation. And as we want in our house in cold weather or warm weather, we want really good insulation. And so for people who are well developed with their reading brain, they have better myelination on these nerve fibers, and they have better pathways between these different areas of the brain. One really interesting and specific example of this is in something called the visual word form area. So the visual word form area is something that we, from an evolutionary perspective, our brain has developed to be able to do things like object recognition or seeing the profile of somebody's face and being able to kind of complete what that would look like. And so because reading is not actually something we're born with the innate ability to do, we actually have to repurpose areas of our brain like the visual word form area. And what happens is that visual word form area allows us to be able to take the objects on the page, the squiggly lines that we call letters, and understand them and then connect them to words and to sounds. And so we have a lot of work to do in the brain as we are developing our reading skill. And although we know quite a bit about the brain and reading, we don't know everything. And that's why we continue to do research.
All right. So, Allison, what are some of the common misconceptions about reading instruction, and how can educators overcome these misconceptions to better support children who learn differently?
Absolutely. So one of the most common misconceptions is that reading comes naturally. So similar to what Ben said, it is not something that just happens. And I think that the outdated mindset is that with exposure and love of literacy and reading together with your family and reading every night and just reading more, children are going to learn how to read. So that's one of the common misconceptions, I believe, understanding that we're just going to read more and read often and love to learn and love to read books, and then magically we'll learn how to read. But unfortunately, that's not the case for most young readers. And it really does have to be taught explicitly using a very explicit, systematic, sequential, and multisensory approach. So starting with the phonemic awareness, building on to the phonics, which will develop accurate decoding and fluent reading. And when we have fluent reading, we have comprehension. So kind of tying it all together, what everybody's sort of already said. But yes, I think it's really important that teachers understand that reading does not come naturally and it has to be taught explicitly.
All right. So, Rose, let's drill down a bit on phonics. How important is that to literacy development, particularly for children with learning and attention issues?
So when we think about that systematic and explicit instruction that has been mentioned, and we think about literacy, literacy is not just reading. That systematic phonics instruction goes so much further. When we think about that phonics instruction, it also goes towards writing. So that phonics instruction is essential towards reading. But for instance, I see it even in college with writing, because that phonics instruction is going to also influence the student's ability to encode, which is going to then impact their writing. So that instruction that we give students is so essential because it's going to impact their reading, which then impacts their writing. So when we talk about, students who have learning disabilities, we see that at all levels. And it's so essential that we get that systematic and that phonics instruction so that, they're able to see that impact with their reading and also with that encoding, because it's going to influence their writing.
All right. So, Dr. Powers, I wanted to go off our discussion a little bit and talk a little bit about the national movement that is happening around the science of reading right now across the nation, and how a number of states are now passing legislation to make sure that schools are adopting instructional practices that incorporate evidence-based research. Is this the right way we should be going?
So absolutely. It's interesting. One of the reasons we know so much about how the reading brain develops is because of learning disabilities like dyslexia. And so for the past 3 decades, there has been a tremendous amount of research being done around reading disabilities like dyslexia. And what we've come to learn through all of this incredible research is that we have this body of knowledge that we can really leverage as the science of reading. And the incredible thing is that while it is critical to develop the reading brain for people with learning disabilities like dyslexia, the science of reading, what we've come to understand is that it actually benefits all learners. And so this has been done through cognitive science, neuroscience, education research. And so it is absolutely the right direction to move in. What we need to be careful of is one of the reasons that we've had poor outcomes with literacy over time is because we've adopted practices that aren't backed by science. And so leveraging science in our instruction is really important. But what's most important as part of that process is to make sure that we are backing the work that we're doing in classrooms with something that's based in evidence, an evidence-based approach to implementing curriculum in school. So while the global notion of the science of reading is a huge step in the right direction, we want to be really careful that the architecture, the framework we build underneath that umbrella of the science of reading is actually built on programs that are developed and evidence-based on credible scientific knowledge and background.
All right, thank you. So, Allison, I wanted to jump off something Dr. Powers just said. You used to be a classroom teacher, and as I understand it, even though more states are embracing the science of reading, there still seems to be some resistance. Based on your experience, why would there be such resistance to an approach that research clearly shows works for all students?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to go into. I go as the owner of the Learning Lab. I go to IEP meetings with the families that are part of the Learning Lab to help advocate for appropriate instruction. And one of those things, of course, being to make sure that the children with dyslexia or specific learning disabilities are getting the science of reading type of instruction, or Orton Gillingham instruction. And really, as Dr. Powers said, this is the best practice and approach for all learners, but my job is to go in there and talk to them about just specifically this student and what is going to be best for them. And I think there's a lot of pushback because it's just that mindset that teachers have where it's just another new thing, another new curriculum coming down. They've seen it all, and this is just another thing. So it's just sort of a jaded mentality, I think. And a lot of people just think, oh, it's worked for so long. You know, why do we need to do anything different? So it's just a mindset. I think that also, unfortunately, many of the colleges are not preparing and educating their the young teachers coming out of certain universities with this information. I, for one, this was not something that I was ever really taught. I had to learn it on my own. And so I think there's just an overall education piece missing in the education world for the teachers and even some of the ESC directors. And it's just about empowering them and educating them on the science. And once they see this evidence and they understand it, there's going to be more buy-in.
All right. So, Rose, you're working on the college level at Beacon College, which is a school that is focused on educating students with learning and attention issues. And I'm wondering, since this approach, the science of reading, is kind of a late trending thing, there may be students who are coming to college who have missed out and may have some deficiencies with reading. Is there any way at the college level to remediate that? Talk about some of the work you're doing at Beacon College.
So there is. So one of the things we've done is we've changed the way we approach literacy here at the college level, because we see so many students arriving with a comprehension level that is not at college level. So one of the things that we've done is we've implemented that explicit, systematic approach to literacy here at the college level. So many of the things that they're doing and talking about with the science of reading, we are implementing at the college level. So building vocabulary, building comprehension, building fluency, vocabulary, phonics, we are actually doing at the college level with the students that are coming in our English classes. So for instance, vocabulary, we're building vocabulary that our students need. So we introduce vocabulary and we'll teach the students what that vocabulary means. We'll find out what background knowledge they might have about that word. We'll explain to them the root pieces of that word. We'll explain in whole group what that word means, demonstrate how it's used, give them context, tell them within our discipline how it's used, but also outside of our discipline how that word is used. We are a vocabulary-rich campus. As far as comprehension, we talk about comprehension and how we build it using graphic organizers, and just we're really trying to build those 5 pillars that we talked about at the very beginning within all of our classrooms, because it's necessary. because we want our students to build those skills that we know they need.
Okay. Dr. Powers, this may be for my own edification, but I'm wondering, are there any distinct types of phonic instruction? And if so, are there differences in effectiveness with them?
Sure. So when we think about those 5 pillars that Rose talked about of what we know to be clear elements of building a proficient reader, phonics is one that gets a lot of attention. And part of the reason it gets so much attention is of all the 5 pillars, it is actually the easiest to teach. And so we really think about that, especially as kids are entering kindergarten and first grade, of taking the phonology, the sounds of words, and linking them to letters. So there's a distinction between phonics and phonemic awareness. So phonemic awareness has to do with the sounds and words, and phonics has to do with tying those sounds to the letters. And so what's really most important when we're thinking about phonics is an approach that is systematic, that is sequential, and that is backed by a research basis. And so there are different phonics programs, there are different curriculum that include phonics instruction. But what's important is that when we think about who's written those curriculum or who has developed that program, that it's something that's based both in science and then also some level of evidence for the efficacy of the outcome for instruction. And so it's really critical we focus on that piece in terms of what types of programs that we're putting in front of our students in the classroom.
All right. So, Allison, I'm wondering, as I think we're talking and focusing on children who have attention issues, who have learning differences, what role does executive functioning play when it comes to the science of reading?
Great question. So executive functioning skills are those skills that are like organization, task initiation, time management, mental flexibility, focus and attention. So it definitely can impact reading in the sense of, in many ways, but mostly I would think in comprehension for the kids that have true attention differences, but it can impact children with dyslexia and language processing differences in all the different pillars that we discussed. And some ways that I've found that are really helpful to explicitly teach those executive functioning skills are tangible tools like graphic organizers, highlighters, color coordinated Post-it notes to go along with those highlighters to really slow down the processes to give them tangible tools to help guide them through. The goal of this reading is to understand. So we're either reading to learn or we're reading to enjoy, we're reading for entertainment. And sometimes many children need explicit tools and strategies to even get to that piece because it may be hard for them to get started or stay focused on what they're reading. And so that it's really helpful to explicitly teach those strategies.
So, Rose, how can educators integrate multisensory techniques into their reading instruction?
So this is one of my favorites because you can use these strategies whether you are working with a pre-K student all the way up to college students. So this is just basically integrating any of our senses into your teaching. And what it does is it takes and improves engagement, which who doesn't want to be more engaged into lessons? Naturally, the minute you integrate multisensory into your instruction, students become much more engaged and they're going to take more out of the instruction. So for instance, in a kindergarten classroom, you might use sand to trace letters into. You can use audio text. You can take story strips and have students take and put them in order to practice beginning to end, and taking the story and put it in order. In a college classroom, we use graffiti posters and we practice taking an article and pulling it apart and talking about journal articles and using it for vocab and getting students up and moving around. So to integrate multisensory pieces is so easy, and it helps with comprehension. It helps, again, with engagement, and It doesn't matter what the age, you're instantly going to see it improve reading, comprehension, and most of all, that engagement.
All right. So, Dr. Powers, for any student to succeed, particularly students with learning differences, is going to require a successful collaboration between the educators, the students, the parents, specialists, the whole kit and caboodle. So I'm wondering how we can optimize that collaboration so that students with learning differences can unlock their potential.
Daryl, I'm glad you used the word environment, because when we think about developing a reading brain, there are really, in my mind, three crucial pieces to that. One is gene or genetics, two is the brain, and the third is environment. And environment is the aspect that we have the most control over at this point. And so creating an environment that is supportive of all students, but especially students who are at risk for reading failure because of a learning disability or another circumstance, is really critical. And so when we think about the environment, one aspect of that is thinking about the tools and resources that we're using in the classroom. So again, making sure that the instructional materials we're putting in front of students are evidence-based. And so being on the same page with parents, with specialists, with the educators in the classroom around that whole notion of the science of reading and being committed to adopting those types of practices. Another key piece is collaboration around making sure that we are doing effective literacy screening, early screening for kids. As Rose said, we can work with kids at college, or we can work with adults who have learning or attention issues. But what we do know from research is that the impact of working with kids early is exponential. We even see differences of working with kids and providing intervention to kids in kindergarten versus first grade, or first grade versus second grade. And so we really want to catch kids by third grade. So making sure we're all on the same page and collaborating around providing resources to be able to screen kids early is critically important. Another incredibly important piece of that environment, though, is the social emotional piece. And sometimes we lose sight of that because we're so focused on curriculum and instruction or assessment. But we really want to create a collaborative environment around how can we best support this student with a learning disability. And a lot of times with the science of reading, what we're talking about is using the same strategies for all students, but kids with learning disabilities need more dosage. They just need more of that type of instruction. And so sometimes that can take away from aspects of the day, whether it's social opportunities or leadership opportunities or extracurricular opportunities. And so working collaboratively to find ways to support students so that they have opportunities that are equal or on par with their classmates. And while intervention and remediation is really important, also finding opportunities to celebrate that individual student's strengths or areas where that student should feel good about themselves. And so, if we can come at it from a lens that students come into school wanting to learn, craving to learn, and being mindful that it's their learning disability might be causing this challenge with accessing the printed word, which is really how we get in front of any of the knowledge that we build in a school environment in most cases. That if we can be flexible and collaborative in that space and find those opportunities to support them holistically, that's how we're going to have the most positive outcomes for students in the classroom.
All right. So Allison, you get to have the last word, and I'm going to send you back into the classroom and ask you this question. How can educators strike the appropriate balance between addressing the specific needs of children with learning and attention issues and maintaining a whole class focus on reading instruction?
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that question. And I think it ties in with exactly what has been said over and over. The science of reading and the appropriate approaches that we now know through research are best practice for all readers. So all kindergarten, all first grade, all second grade classrooms should be following the science of reading for their whole group instruction. Offering those multisensory opportunities with the environment, having the explicit, systematic, sequential, and I said multisensory approach for all the young early readers in the classroom. The only difference is that those kids that are identified and from early detection, we know that they are experiencing learning differences because of dyslexia, specific learning disability, or attention differences. They just need more. They just are going to need more of it They're going to need it more consistently, more intensity with it. As Dr. Powers said, a higher dosage. So I think that it's totally doable for teachers to implement this in a whole group situation. And then, of course, when we do small group pullouts, or we do small group in the classroom, or we're doing centers and we're having all kinds of hands-on learning opportunities, it's doable to teach this best practice to all the learners and be able to give a higher dosage to the children who truly need a little bit more.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave this very important conversation right there. Rose DeJarnette, Dr. Ben Powers, and Allison Young, thanks for the knowledge.